Okay, welcome to this afternoon session. We are very pleased and honored to have Emmanuel Farhi. Nobody knows it, but Emmanuel Farhi studied in this institution, I believe, as a master's student before starting his PhD somewhere in the United States, in a university near Boston. That's how you call it, right? And you have 50 minutes to talk to us, explain to us your model of the international monetary system.
Okay, so thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be back here to present this paper, which is joint with my colleague and co-author Matteo Maggiori at Harvard. So it's a paper about the international monetary system, and it's a bit of a funny topic in the sense that it's been the constant focus of world powers. If you read books about economic history, these things are a big deal. It's been the subject of innumerable international policy initiatives, and it's captured the imagination of some of the best economic minds. But it remains a bit of an elusive topic with little or no organizing framework. And the manifestation of this fuzziness is that even among academic economists, there's little consensus as to what are the main organizing features, the main defining features of the international monetary system. And so we're going to take a stand on what these defining features are. One of them is going to be the exchange rate regime, whether you have a regime of fixed exchange rates or floating exchange rates or managed floating exchange rates. Then issues that are related to international financial architecture. What's the role of international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF? And thinking more broadly about the role of risk-sharing institutions and risk-sharing arrangements like swap lines between central banks and reserve-sharing agreements. And finally, questions that are related to the provision and the use of international reserve assets. So think about the assets that are held by central bank across the world and close substitutes. And there are a number of fundamental questions that are related to these topics, and a number of historical facts and opinions that speak to it. But again, very little formal analysis. So we're going to try to make some progress in this direction. There are questions related to what are the characteristics of a hegemonic system versus a multipolar system. So these are words that are used to describe systems where you have one currency that plays a very central role. And the name that's attributed to this currency is that of a hegemon. So think about the US, for example, under Bretton Woods and to some extent today, versus a more multipolar system when you have different currencies that are fulfilling that role and you have some elements of competition between these currencies. And so think about the interwar period and the coexistence of the dollar and sterling. So historically, what you see is that there's a lot of concentration, for example, in the reserve markets. And you have either one or two major currencies. One question is why that's the case. And then what are the determinants of which currencies become these reserve currencies? What does it take? What are the properties of these systems? Are they stable? Are they unstable? Are they efficient in the sense that they provide adequate anchors and adequate supply of reserve assets? And how does all this interact with issues about exchange rate regimes and financial architecture? So we're going to try to provide a framework to think about all this. And we're going to be able to sort of provide a historical narrative through the lens of this model, to revisit the leading historical debates, and also to provide new insights. So you're probably not all specialists of the international monetary system, so this is a rough timeline that walks you through some important events and we start with the period of the classical gold standard in 1870. So you have the classical gold standard until World War I, then it's suspended. And after World War I, there's basically a decision by the main country and followed by a lot of other countries to go back to the gold standard, and even to go back to the gold standard at the pre-World War I parities. Okay? But there's an understanding at the time that this might be problematic because maybe you're not going to have enough gold to provide sufficient reserves for the system to function properly. And so there's this very important conference that takes place, which is the Genoa Conference, And I got the date wrong here. It's in 1922. And what happens there is sort of a coordinated decision by central banks to go back to a form of gold standard, but to allow monetary assets to be held as reserves. So not just gold, but also other currency like the dollar and sterling. And so after that, you have the emergence of the first gold exchange standard, where basically you have fractional backing of the main currencies by gold, and you have central banks around the world holding gold, but also monetary assets as reserves. And then the system collapses in two sort of big blows at the end of the 20s, at the beginning of the 30s. First, in 1931, Britain goes off the gold standard and devalues sterling. And that creates a bit of a run on the system. So you see a run on monetary asset, a big disintermediation. The US goes up the gold standard in 1933, and then the gold standard is suspended until the end of World War II. And before that happens, you have this period of a gold exchange standard between 1920 and 1931, where you have this coexistence of dollar and sterling. And I'll show you some numbers about this. And there's an economist, Ragnar Nurks, who's a Scandinavian economist, who was writing about that period and noticing that there was a lot of monetary instability. So frequent shifts in portfolios in central banks between dollar and sterling. And so he documented that, and he proposed the idea that a system of two main currencies could be inherently unstable in a sense, because it would create coordination problem among investors. So people running away from the dollar and into sterling and vice versa. And this is something that you see to some extent in the portfolios of the central banks and in the share of dollar and sterling during that period. Okay, so the system is suspended, and then after World War II, a new system is reinstated. It's the Bretton Woods system, which comes into place after the Bretton Woods Conference. And basically, it's a gold exchange standard. All the currencies are convertible to the dollar, and the dollar is convertible to gold at a given parity. And that system stays in place until 1971, 1973, depending on how you count. And some people sort of foresaw the possibility that this system could not last forever. So there's this important economist, Triffin, who formalized what is now called the Triffin dilemma. He was writing in the 60s, so under Bretton Woods. And his idea was that there was a fundamental tension in the system, in the sense that you had one country, the US, who was in the business of supplying reserves to the rest of the world. And then the rest of the world was growing faster than the US. So the demand for reserves was growing faster than the ability of the US to supply these reserves. So this was going to pose a dilemma. Either the US would not accommodate this growing demand for reserves, then there wouldn't be enough reserves in the system, and that would be recessionary and deflationary. Or the US would indeed accommodate this growing demand for reserves, but then it would have to stretch itself, to stretch its fiscal capacity, and it would become vulnerable to a confidence crisis. Today we would say a run. Okay. This being economics, somebody took the other side of this debate, and there's a very famous paper by Kindleberger, Desprez, and Salant that spells out a very different view of the Bretton Woods system. So according to them, there was nothing unnatural or necessarily unstable about that system, and the right way to think about it was just that the US was essentially operating as a big bank for the world, a world banker that was in the business of supplying safe assets to the rest of the world and accumulating risky assets on the asset side of its balance sheet. Okay, so it was basically financial intermediation on a global scale, and they thought that there was nothing fundamentally problematic about this. At that time, that view was called the minority view, so this gives you an idea of the prominence of the Triffin view. And so then in 71 and later in 73, the US basically went off the gold exchange standard, devalued the dollar after an attempt to rescue it. And at the time, this was seen as a vindication of the arguments of Triffin. And since then, we've been living under a system of floating exchange rate. But I'll show you that, surprisingly, the relative importance of the dollar in many dimensions has remained very large, and in some dimensions has actually increased. And so the questions that were with us during that era are sort of still with us today. And there is a question when you look forward whether that preeminence of the dollar is going to be maintained or is going to be challenged by other currencies. So you could think about the euro or maybe the Chinese currency. And there are a lot of questions as to whether that's a development that's necessarily going to happen, how long it would take, and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So before I show you the sort of little model that we lay down to sort of think about all this, I want to show you some facts with some graphs. So the first fact is about what happened after the Genoa conference, so during the establishment of the gold exchange standard between the two world wars. And this documents the amount of gold and the amount of monetary reserves. And the black line is the fraction of monetary reserve. So what you see is the emergence of monetary reserves as a reserve asset. It expands during the 20s, and then there's a collapse of the monetary share of reserves starting in 31 and then eventually in 33. So complete disintermediation of the gold exchange standard, and I'll come back to that. And during the interwar period, you had the two currencies that were absolutely dominant. It's the dollar and sterling. So this is a snapshot that shows you at a given point in time, and during that period, or maybe it's average shares over the period, the share of the British pound and the share of US dollars. Okay, and you see that it's basically an equal share duopoly. What you do not see here, and we're working on trying to muster some data to document that, is the switches between dollar and sterling that were occurring during this period. So the idea is that if you were to recompute this chart at different points in time, you would see very pronounced changes in the composition of these relative reserves. And what you certainly see also is if you look at particular central banks, then you see big switches between the two. Okay. And so that's the period that Marx was talking about when he was thinking about the instability of the system. So this is something that documents the end of the gold exchange standard. You see the British pound devalues in 1931, and you see the share of British pound in reserves completely collapsing after that. And you see that sort of coincidentally, or maybe because of the sort of run that's triggered by, the general run that's triggered by the devaluation of sterling, you see that the dollar share is also tanking. And then in 33, the dollar devalues as well. So the other element that I wanted to bring up is the fact that these changes were very abrupt and to some extent unanticipated. So the Bank of France was a very important holder of sterling at the time. And it became very concerned that sterling would eventually devalue. So they were trying to get out of their sterling reserves. But then they realized that by doing that, they were feeding the problem in some sense. So they had to stop. They were stuck with the bill, and they experienced a very big loss when sterling actually devalued that precipitated a technical bankruptcy of the Bank of France. The loss was extremely large. This is documenting the end of Bretton Woods and the sort of things that made the Triffin conjecture his dilemma. So you see the US gold stock, and then you see total external liabilities and official external dollar liabilities of the US. And so basically the US was starting to expand its reserves, both in terms of official reserves and in terms of external position compared to its gold stock. And that means that were everybody to start demanding conversion of their dollar assets into gold, that would create a problem, and the US wouldn't be able to deliver, and it would force.
If I can interrupt, could you remind us briefly what Bretton Woods was all about? Is that the dollar was convertible to gold, but the dollar money supply was not backed by a stock of gold?
Right, so it's a gold exchange standard, a bit like the gold exchange standard of the interwar period, so there was no provision that said that the US had to follow some rules of the game, so they could expand their monetary assets as much as they wanted.
Change
They were forced to convert, but
Right.
they were not forced to be careful about the expansion of their. They were bound by a fixed parity, and and
Any bank possible.
sure, but that's why it's perhaps relevant to see this as a. I mean, the banking analogy is
But there was no international capital mobility.
during Bretton Woods less than today, but there was. So if you look at the.
This did not violate the impossible trilogy in some sense.
So you had much less capital integration during that era than today. You had capital controls. This was allowed. And you actually see that the gross positions and the net positions were a lot smaller than what they are today. Okay. And so these problems, which if you look at them today with the perspective of the positions today, they look tiny, actually. And you'll see that the problem is a lot bigger today. Okay. But so anyways, in 71 and 73, they go off. And finally, this is documenting the share of reserves of different currencies. And you see the collapse of the British pound, the rise of the dollar. And I think very impressively, if you look at it today, the share of the dollar in world reserves is something like 70%. And the only other currency that plays somewhat of an important role is the euro, but compared to the relative size of these two economies, it's very small. So the dollar remains in a very central position today. That has only been slightly diminished compared to the Bretton Woods era. And so one question is whether the Triffin logic sort of remains with us today, and whether there's sort of a modern version of the Triffin dilemma that we should be concerned about. Okay, so we're not operating in a vacuum. We're building on some previous literature, and I'll mention my work with Ricardo and the work of Pierre-Olivier and Hélène on these topics. So let me sort of flesh out the very simple structure that we're going to use to understand these arguments, to make them more precise. To give you an idea, like when Triffin was talking about his dilemma, it's not exactly clear what the source of the fragility should be. Should it be the official position, the external position? Should it be the net? Should it be the gross? It's entirely unclear in his writing and in the logic that he spells out. And so one of the benefits we think of sort of trying to put a little minimal theory on this is to be more precise, and then to see if the specific mechanisms that we propose can be the ones that rationalize these concerns and the historical evidence. Okay, so here's the model. It's extremely simple. And I'm gonna, the structure of the presentation is gonna follow the structure of the model, which is very modular. So you have a core model that's very, very simple. It's the hegemon model, and it abstracts from a bunch of issues. And a number of things that I talked about in my introduction slide, you're not gonna be able to talk about them directly in this simple structure. But it can very easily be extended to incorporate these things, and that's the way I'm going to proceed. So I'll reach the model as I go along. So there are two periods and two countries. There's rest of the world, which is demanding reserves. And there's one country, the reserves country, which is in the position of supplying these reserves. So you see that right away there's only one issuer, the hegemon. That's why we call it the hegemon model. And later on I will introduce competition among issuers. There are two assets in this world. And the rest of the world is going to try to invest its wealth, its savings, into risky assets and into safe reserve assets. And the idea is that there are a lot of risky assets out there, okay, and so that's sort of easy to manufacture, and we're going to capture that with the assumption that the supply of risky assets is very elastic, in fact, infinitely elastic in this model. So you have an asset that pays a high return if there's no disaster. That's just a word that I'm going to be using to talk about this binary stochastic structure. And then a low return if there's a disaster. Okay? And that asset, so there are probabilities of these two states, and the variance of this asset is going to be important, and I'm going to denote it sigma squared. So it's how risky this asset is. And then you have a reserve country, who is in the unique position of supplying a safe asset. And it's a safe asset that is a nominal asset. It's denominated in its own currency, and it pays interest. okay, which is exactly what reserves are in the world. They're things like US Treasuries and things of that sort. Okay, and importantly, it has a monopoly power over the provision of these assets. So the idea is that the risky asset is easy to manufacture. You have lots of competition. Issuing something that's safe is difficult, so difficult that, in fact, only one country can do it. But you'll see that these insights generalize if the other countries that can do it are small. They don't have a lot of fiscal capacity. And if they become big, then things become more interesting, and I'll talk about it later. So that hegemon is going to supply these reserve assets, and then at date 0, and then at date 1, it's going to face a decision whether to devalue its currency or not to devalue its currency. So if it devalues its currency, it's a loss for the holders of the reserve assets. Okay? And the reason we're focusing on depreciation and not on default is that there's never been a default of a major reserve currency. There have been, as I told you, many instances of depreciation.
Sorry, are you using that? Because I mean, you bundle two things there, the denomination and the safety.
I will use it.
They're associated.
I think, well, historically there's no default, it's devaluation. But you'll see that the fact that it is a devaluation will be important when I introduce other elements in the model, but not in the basic structure. Okay? And so that country is going to be risk neutral. So that's going to be the difference with the rest of the world, which is going to be risk averse. So the rest of the world will demand some safety. And the reserve country will be in the position of supplying this safety because it's okay bearing the corresponding risk. Okay, so that's obviously not a fantastic microfoundation. It's a bit of a proxy for, let's say, having a better financial system that allows you to handle those risks better, which was always an important characteristic of dominant currencies.
So the markets are highly incomplete, right?
Yes.
And you cannot insure against EL.
That's right.
And maybe the supplier would have an interest in issuing such insurance.
So that we're going to look at. We're going to look at insurance later on and to what extent this could relieve some of the tension and some of the pressure that's put on the system. Okay. So the rest of the world is risk averse, has mean variance preferences over date 1 consumption. It has a big endowment of savings, W star, and it's going to decide how to invest this pool of savings. So they're going to take that into account when they form their portfolios. And if they believe that there will be no depreciation, then the asset is safe from their perspective. If they think that there might be a depreciation, they're going to treat the asset as risky.
So it's not that risky.
It's endogenous, which is part of the point of the structure, actually. So we're going to see when that happens and that sort of stuff. Okay. So here's the timing. It's a game.
So just another question. So sorry, I should not do that. But would things be any different if instead of devaluating, you could choose to default on the bond?
In the basic structure, a lot of things would be similar. Okay, and again, the reason why I'm choosing devaluation is because historically, that's what they do. They don't do straight defaults. And then you will see that it will be different when I introduce other elements of the model, such as nominal rigidities, and when I try to think about the exchange rate regime and things like that, which is not there for now. Okay. So here are the two periods. At time 0, the reserve country is going to choose how many reserves to issue. Then after that, the rest of the world is going to form its portfolio. And there is going to be the place where there can be multiple equilibria. You can have confidence crises, you can have runs, and they're going to occur exactly there. And they're going to depend on the expectations that the rest of the world has. Okay, so there are going to be regimes where basically if the rest of the world thinks that the hegemon will behave, then a low interest rate prevails on reserves. And given that a low interest rate is charged on reserves, it is indeed in the best interest of the hegemon not to devalue its currency. And vice versa, if they doubt the trustworthiness of the hegemon, then they believe that the asset is risky, and then they're going to charge a higher interest rate, and that's going to lead the hegemon to devalue. So it's the very familiar logic of self-fulfilling speculative attacks and runs, which we're going to build into the model at this stage.
That's a key difference between risky and
Yeah.
That one is the rules, there is no corner, and each one
Is implied.
is
That's right.
stability of the system.
That's right. Okay, so when that's done, the portfolios are formed and everything, then the uncertainty is going to be realized. Either we're in the good state and everything is okay, or we're in the bad state. And if we're in the bad state, then the reserve country can possibly devalue its currency. Okay, and then the payoffs are going to be distributed. All right, so this is the timeline, and we're now going to solve this model, and I will start backwards as what must be done with these games. So first, we're going to look at the decision to devalue. Okay, so we're at date 1. The bad shock has occurred. There's a lot of pressure. And the question is whether the hegemon devalues its currency or try to preserve the value of the reserves in the hand of foreigners. And you see that that decision is going to hinge on the cost-benefit analysis. So the benefit of depreciating is going to be that you're going to owe less to foreigners. So B, the amount of reserves you've issued, R is the interest rate that's charged on these reserves, and 1 minus EL is how much you reduce the value of these reserves if you devalue. Okay, so it's like inflating away the debt, if you want, but with also an international dimension. And then what's going to hold back this hegemon is a cost of depreciating its currency, which here is completely reduced form, but which is meant to be a proxy for, let's say, the reputation of being the issuer of the reserve currency, or also the straight default cost that could be associated with it and the mess that's created. And it's something that we microfound in the paper as a reputational cost in a dynamic version of the model. And one of the things that's interesting is that that cost becomes endogenous to a number of interesting elements of the model, such as the amount of competition, so how many issuers you have. I'll talk about that later. So because of these normalizations, there's a very simple rule that's going to determine whether you devalue or not, and it's whether B times R is greater than tau. Okay, so if you've issued a lot of debt, or the interest rate on this debt is very high, then you're going to be tempted to devalue.
Where is the disaster here?
This is conditional.
Yeah, but very.
This is when, basically the idea is that in the good state, we're going to abstract away from these decisions because the benefits would be too small. But in the bad state, you're confronted with them. So this is all conditional. And
The bad state would be like totally smaller or something.
right. Or maybe there are other things that I'll talk about later.
Tau is smaller in a bad state in your dynamic game extension of that. Right?
That's right.
Because here tau is just exogenous.
Sure.
And the state does not appear in that inequality.
No, but I'm not showing you what happens in the good state. So you could think that there's a high tau in the good state. Just as a mathematical possibility.
Of course.
There are other reasons.
I can make up any assumption about tau to get the results that I want, but it's more elegant to prove that tau is higher in the good state than to assume it. Right?
So I will show you later the dynamic model that will deliver on your desiderata. There is so here in this basic model, there's only one reason to devalue, which is to release the fiscal burden. Later, when I introduce nominal rigidities and I think about the exchange rate regime and everything, there'll be other reasons to devalue, which will be, for example, like if your exchange rate is too appreciated compared to what's required for macroeconomic stability, so if you are experiencing a recession, then you're going to be tempted to devalue your currency as well. And it will have the side effect of eroding the value of your debt at the same time. Okay? So I'll talk about that a bit later, and that's another thing that could make the temptation to devalue larger in bad times. But that's going to come only later. Okay. So let me roll it back one period now, and we're thinking about the formation of the portfolios of the rest of the world. So there are two regimes that, as I already talked about, depending whether the bond is expected to be safe or is not expected to be safe. So if the bond is expected to be safe, you have a monopoly over the supply of this safe asset, and so you're facing an imperfectly elastic demand curve. And the elasticity of this demand curve is controlled by the amount of risk aversion and by sort of the badness of the alternative. So if there's a lot of risk, then that demand curve is also going to be less elastic. Okay. So that's one case. And then if the bond is expected to be risky, then just to make the model very tractable, I'm going to assume that the amount of depreciation is such that the bond then becomes a perfect substitute for the risky asset. So that means that you lose all your monopoly rents if the bond is expected to be risky, and then the expected return on the bond has to be equal to that of the risky asset. And obviously that's a simplifying assumption, but what happens in the model is that the amount of monopoly power that you retain depends on the correlation between the two assets, the risky asset. And so you lose some monopoly power. Whether you lose it completely is a special case, but it's nice for illustrative purposes. So you see here that there's only one reason to demand these reserve assets, and it's their safety. In the paper, I'm not going to have time to talk about it. We talk about other benefits of holding reserve assets, liquidity benefits, and liquidity benefits come with network effects. The more people are using the dollar, let's say, the more attractive it becomes to use the dollar because it's a very liquid market. And we think also about the private issuance of safe assets, which I'm not talking about here. Basically, as long as this private issuance is not infinite, then the hegemon still faces an imperfectly elastic residual demand curve, and the analysis goes. So now I'm rolling it back again one period, and it's the issuance decision of the hegemon. So the hegemon has to decide. Think about the Triffin dilemma. You know, the U.S. is confronted with a very high demand for reserve assets, and it has to decide how much of this demand to accommodate. And this is what it's going to look like. So there are three regions of issuance. First, if the hegemon issues a lot of reserves, then there's only one equilibrium. It's the bad equilibrium, where investors are convinced that the U.S. will devalue in bad times, charge the U.S. a high interest rate, and indeed the U.S. devalues in bad times. So there's no point in issuing in that region. Then on the other extreme, there's a safe zone, where you issue few reserves. Given that you issue few reserves, there's only one equilibrium, the good equilibrium, okay, where the investors trust that the U.S. will not devalue, charge the U.S. a low interest rate, and given that they charge the U.S. an interest rate, it is indeed in the interest of the U.S. not to devalue exposed. And finally, there's this region which is more interesting, which is the instability region, where you have the coexistence of the good equilibrium and the bad equilibrium. So you have multiple self-fulfilling equilibria here, which rely on the trust that's in the system and the coordination of investors. And so I have to select equilibria, and I'm going to do something very simple. You could examine more complicated selection rules. I'm just going to use a sunspot with a constant probability. Okay, so if you issue in that region with probability alpha, you get bad expectations, and then you will devalue if there's a bad shock. And with probability 1 minus alpha, everything is fine.
And that in this model, I don't know whether you have the extension. Doesn't depend on the potential existence of a substitute. That's
right. So that comes later. That's very important. That's huge. Yeah. So not here, but later. Yeah. Oh, this broke down. No. All right. So mathematically, you can think of the issuance of the hegemon in this way. And the only reason I'm showing this is that you're going to see a bit more concretely what are the determinants of the trade-off that the hegemon is facing. So alpha of b is as a function of b. What's the probability that you're going to devalue exposed if there's a bad shock? Okay. So if that happens, then you have to pay the depreciation cost, the devaluation cost. Okay. So maybe you lose your reputation with some probability. So think about the UK in 31, they devalue, and they lost their preeminence in the international monetary system. Only because if debt is very small, only because of the zones, but it's a step function. Okay, so the other side is with probably 1 minus alpha of b, you've issued b, and then you're going to earn some rents on this b. And these rents are going to be commensurate with the risk premium, with the gap between the high expected return on the risky alternatives and the low interest rate that the investors are charging you. Okay. And so that's going to scale with this risk premium and with the amount of issuance. And below is the equation that determines the interest rate. So you can first solve the equilibrium under full commitment if we remove the option to devalue, expose. And that's going to be useful in order to analyze the problem with limited commitment. So in that case, the optimal supply of the hegemon is characterized by a very standard Lerner condition. Okay, so you charge a markup basically, and the markup is the gap between the risky interest rate and the safe interest rate. And that markup is going to be a function of the elasticity of demand, which is gamma sigma squared. So if you solve the equilibrium, then you can compute the total amount of monopoly rents that are extracted by the hegemon. And they're the product of how much you're issuing times the markup, so the risk premium. And it's given by this value here. So it's higher if the rest of the world is more risk averse. If the alternatives are worse, sigma square is high. And if there's a lot of demand for reserve assets, if W star is high. So that's an equivalent in the model of what people refer to as the exorbitant privilege. Okay, so the possibility that the hegemon country extracts a huge privilege from being at the center of the country. That's an expression that was floated by Giscard d'Estaing when he was finance minister of de Gaulle, and they were challenging the preeminence of the dollar. And there's a sense here in which this privilege is really exorbitant in the sense that it is a monopoly rent. Okay, it is something that the U.S. is experiencing because it is in this very.
There is no evidence that the U.S. has ever used that first order condition.
Okay, so
public debt is the issue for entirely different reasons.
So Ricardo is very well versed in mapping models into data and vice versa. So the right way to interpret this. So the right way to interpret this model is not to say that you have a technocrat who is sitting in an office and trying to analyze the elasticity of the demand curve, but just that the U.S. has to finance itself, and the interest rate depends on the amount of debt that's issued, and of course the U.S. to some level is responsive to the conditions at which it can finance itself. Okay. And so the view is that this matters in terms of the issuance.
Just to understand, here the monopoly run by influencing the price of risk. So in terms of the zone, where are we here?
So here is under full commitment, so there are no zones. There's one big safe zone. Okay, so that's going to the trade-offs are going to come later.
So it's a privilege, but backed by, it's not the privilege really, I think.
So it's a privilege backed by taxes.
By their own taxes.
So you would need to have the fiscal capacity to back these reserves to not devalue. But if you were not a monopolist, there would be more reserve issued, and indeed that whole risk premium would be competed away. So there would be no rent anymore.
But I think the Giscard thing was more in the multiple zone. That is, it's not even backed, and yet they can do it. That's where it's exorbitant compared to a situation in which you produce a riskless asset which is backed by your tax.
Well, here the idea is because you're in the central position, you can finance yourself cheaply. Okay, and if you were not in this central position, you would not experience that privilege. Okay, so now we go to the limited commitment equilibrium, and we recover the three zones. And there are two cases that are interesting. The first one is the boring one, and let me describe it. So here on the x-axis you have B, the amount of reserves that have been issued, and on the y-axis you have the expected value of the rents for the hegemon, net of the devaluation cost. So the objective function of the hegemon. And the parabola is the value under full commitment. And the solid line is what happens under limited commitment. So you see that if you enter in the instability region, if you issue in the instability region, the value is lower by a discrete amount, which reflects the probability of a run. Okay. So in this particular example, what happens is that the peak under full commitment is inside the safe zone. Okay, so you can replicate the full commitment outcome even if you don't have full commitment. And so that's where you choose to issue. You choose to issue in the safe zone, and that's going to happen if the demand for reserves from the rest of the world is relatively low, or if your commitment technology, if your reputation is sufficiently high, and in an extension of the model, if your fiscal capacity is sufficiently high. So you're okay repaying.
Can let me go back to what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
Is that I mean, I don't think that, again, that treasuries decide fiscal in this way. But the question is whether you could transfer it to the Fed or to the central bank. I mean, because the issue is monetization of whatever debt. So can I think of the Fed as being the optimizer, which is
so
much more
how do I should have said that? This is a very good question. How do you think practically of the decision to devalue and how it unfolds? So you have to think of situations where you have like fiscal stress and everything, and so in those cases, you lose monetary dominance and you start having fiscal dominance, and so you start having like fiscal determination of the exchange rate, which is the case you can make for many of these episodes actually. So it could go through monetization, for example. So this is the more interesting case where the peak under full commitment is inside the instability zone. Okay, and in fact, the way I drew it, even taking into account the possibility of a run, you decide to issue inside the instability zone. So here you see that you face a trade-off, you face a dilemma. Okay, there's a large demand for reserve assets, and you can either you're going to either decide to issue at the boundary of the safe zone. So you have to curtail your issuance, but then it's going to be safe for sure. Or you're going to decide to issue more to accommodate this growing demand for reserves, but then you're going to take the risk that there might be a run on your currency. So it's one way of formalizing the Triffin dilemma, in a sense. And it makes it much more precise because you can trace exactly what is the source of the instability and the fragility. And so in this model, the right way to think about the fragility of the system is the gross dollar external net position of the US. Okay? And that's what really comes out. It also builds a bridge, actually, between these two views that were seen as being opposed in the 60s, the Triffin dilemma and the minority view, the World Banker view. Because in our model, the US is indeed performing financial intermediation on a large scale. It's issuing reserve assets and investing in riskier assets. Okay, so it's a way to connect the two. And if you think about the position of the US today, like these external positions are much bigger than they used to be. Okay, and you see that in that logic, this logic of the Triffin dilemma really transcends the particulars of exchange rate regimes. Okay. So in some sense, there's a chance that the Triffin dilemma perhaps is still with us today, and it's something that we should concern ourselves with. And it's another thing that I think is interesting to mention, and which connects with this this analogy with the World Banker, is the following. So what's the solution to runs in traditional banking? It's lender of last resort. Okay, that's how we do deposit guarantees and various liquidity programs and things like that when things are bad, and we manage to stave off the runs and to stabilize the system. Or it's very hard to think of a lender of last resort that will be big enough to sort of shoulder a run on the dollar today. So it's a harder problem to solve, and certainly one that hasn't been solved at this point.
Also, the other solution is to suspend convertibility in the bank, right? In the diamond and DB, you suspend convertibility, which was maybe what they had in 1971. You temporarily suspend.
That's right. They tried to do that, and then eventually they had to.
And just to think about high demand, so the difference between the other slide where you're always within the the green zone, and where you go to the interesting case is your small demand. So in a growing world economy, somehow you are bound to end up with.
Right. So it depends on the relative size of the issuer versus the rest of the world.
But if the rest of the world is growing at a path which makes it necessary that at one point it will be bigger than the taxing capability of the US, which was perhaps another way of interpreting the truth.
Exactly.
There will come a point, maybe we're not there yet, where necessarily you will face.
Exactly. So Triffin was one of the arguments of Triffin, which is that the rest of the world is growing faster than the issuer, and so you are going to end up in a situation like this.
But for that, you need a substitute.
Right.
We're coming to it.
Hold on. Okay. But you know, a signature of this today, I mean, there are other factors behind that, is the very low interest rates that we're experiencing on safe assets. And I think is what you're saying is should make us think that maybe this situation is going to continue. So I have, what, 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, so I told you about the private decision by the issuer, by the hegemon, whether to go in the risky zone or not. This was the private version of Triffin. And we can try to think about what would be socially efficient. Okay. And it turns out that it depends on the shape of the demand curve. And basically, in the model that I presented, if the hegemon decides to go risky, then that's also what the world would have wanted. But if you make the demand curve for reserve assets convex enough, which means that having a few reserve assets is really important, much more than later, then you can reverse that conclusion. Because the hegemon does not take into account the fact that by issuing risky, it's going to wipe out the whole inframarginal surplus of consumers. Okay? So it could be that the hegemon decides to go risky, but from the perspective of the rest of the world, it's the alternative that would have been preferable. So maybe the hegemon takes too much risk. So let me, in the few minutes that I have left, tell you about some of the extensions that we do of this basic modular structure. One of them is to think about competition, so multiple issuers. Okay. So there we introduce, to begin with, a multipolar world where you have n identical, for simplicity for now, issuers of reserve currencies, and they're going to compete à la Cournot. Okay, so each one issues reserves, and that's the dimension on which they compete. And the equilibrium takes a familiar form. You see that the total amount of reserves that's being issued is increasing in the number of issuers, but that the amount of issuance per issuer goes down. Okay. And you see that the rents are slowly being competed away. So when n goes to infinity, you go to perfect competition, there are no more rents. It turns out that when n is sufficiently large, okay, then every country is going to be in its safe zone because they issue less and less. So the equilibrium with limited commitment coincides with the full equilibrium of full commitment when n is large enough. And so that's one way of seeing some of the benefits of a multipolar world, that it dissipates the monopoly rents that are associated with a multipolar world. And here there would be no issues about stability because eventually you're in the safe zone, so the system would be stable as well. Another thing that you see is that the biggest benefits in this Cournot model is from competition is for the first few entrants. Okay, so having 2 or 3 issuers is a big deal. Having 1,000 issuers, a much smaller deal. So that sort of paints a rosy picture of a world where you would have the dollar, the Chinese currency, and the euro. And to see the darker side is where we try to bring in some of the ideas of NERCs. And it's the following idea. So imagine that you have 2 issuers, and now that sort of compounds the coordination problems for investors, because they not only have to coordinate on whether they treat one particular issuer safe versus risky, but they have to coordinate between the 2 reserve assets. Okay, and that in itself can create instability and can create more runs. Okay, so that it could be that by having a second issuer, maybe you compete away some of the monopoly runs, but you introduce a lot of instability in the system. I don't have time to explain to you exactly how that works, but that's the gist of it. Then we do a lot more stuff in the paper, and there's a lot that we still want to do. It's a bit of a research agenda. So let me list a few things. The first thing is to think more seriously about private issuance and private substitutes for reserve assets. So you probably know that there's a lot of private dollar issuance in the world, and not all of it takes place in the US. And we have a way of sort of thinking about that. Then we have this infinite horizon model that I was talking about, and which microfounds this tau as a reputation. And it works as follows. Basically, if you devalue, then the investors are going to start doubting you. So they're going to give you bad expectations. And so you're going to experience bad expectations more often. And so what that means is that when you take the decision to devalue, the risk you're facing is to lose future monopoly rents. And what's interesting about that is that these future monopoly rents are endogenous to the amount of competition. So imagine that you have a world with more issuers. Then what's going to happen is that the value of future monopoly rents is going to go down because you're going to share them with other people. So that's something that endogenously is going to limit the amount of discipline in the system and sort of create instability. So it's another version of another way of seeing the Nurse argument. Then we have a way of thinking about the endogenous emergence of a hegemon. What would be its characteristics? So we think about fiscal capacity, reputation. Interestingly, there's an interaction with the dollar being used as a reserve asset and the dollar being used as a currency of pricing. So as you probably know, a lot of trade, for example, is denominated in dollars, okay, even for countries that are not US. And what that does is the following, that the price of goods in dollars is going to be more stable than in other currencies. And so that gives an advantage to the dollar when it supplies a nominal asset that is also denominated in dollar because it's endogenously safer. We have a whole theme which is about the amplification of small differences through liquidity and network effects, and about the idea that maybe there's something like a natural monopoly in the business of supplying reserve assets where you have large fixed costs, you need to establish your reputation by behaving in large crises, and then some small rents to sustain the investment. And so maybe it's profitable for a few entrants, but not for many. And we have a way of thinking about maybe how to alleviate some of these problems by sort of boosting the institutions that are doing lender of last resort and risk sharing at the global level. So think about the IMF and the various contingent credit lines that the IMF is producing. Think about reserve sharing agreements that are not working so well today, but maybe could be expanded. And think more importantly about swap lines between central banks, which played a major role in stabilizing the crisis in Europe. So that's something that would mitigate the demand for reserve assets and could relieve some of the pressure on their demand. And finally, we have a way of thinking about how that interacts with the exchange rate regime. So what we do is we introduce nominal rigidities and we analyze the gold exchange standard and then a system of floating exchange rates at or away from the ZLB, and you see how it all interacts.
Okay. Thank you. Perhaps we could take one question at most, or one remark. Yes, Ricardo.
I completely buy the story as a safe asset story. I could have removed the currency and it would have been a safe asset story, and it makes a lot of sense to me. But what is special about the currency? Why is this? You said a little bit about transaction prices at the end, but that's probably endogenous as well, so I don't know. What do you see as special of the currency denomination? Because a solution in your model would have been for the US to issue euro dollars, and then there's no risk. No?
And in fact, some of that happened, but not by the US. But where first, these assets are denominated in dollars, and the US issues mostly in dollars, but that's not a theoretical justification. Where that is really special and is different from what you're thinking about is when you think about the exchange rate regime. So there you really have the fact that these assets are denominated in a specific currency which might coincide or not with the currency in which goods are priced becomes very important. For example, the decision to devalue your currency, okay, is going to be driven by two factors now. Eroding the value of your debt, inflating away the debt, and maybe stabilizing your economy by depreciating.
But I could separate those two things. That's what
no, but it's interesting that they come together. And in fact, if you look at historical episodes, you see that it's a commingling of these factors that seems to explain when reserve countries go off the gold standard. It was true in 31 for Britain, in 33 for the US. It was true again in 71 and 73. So I think it's the strength of the model to link them.
No, but I think that you haven't linked them. I mean, artificially you link them. The question is, what is the deep reason that links them? That's what I'm asking you. I suspect there is something to do with the safety, has to do with the fact that it's denominated in your own currency as well. And so probably the fiscal constraint that you face when it's denominated is different, and there is something deeper there.
So the one place where we touch on what you're saying, the deeper foundations of the demand for safe assets and what exactly is safety and everything, is when we think of the currency of goods pricing and the fact that, if a lot of goods are priced in dollars, let's say, that sort of gives an advantage to the US in supplying an asset that is safe when denominated in this currency, because it's going to be stable.
Okay, Daniel, last word.
Just a word on the instability which is created by the multipolar world, the question by Nursky and so on. If I understand the logic, if the multipolar world allows you to go back to the green zone, then it's not unstable, right? So it becomes really beneficial when, in response to a growing economy, you have more people supplying the backed riskless asset, and then we're out of just instability.
So one possibility, going very much along your comment, is that the benefits of entry and competition are a bit U-shaped. So initially, it could be that when you have just a few entrants, it's destabilizing because you experience this deterioration of coordination. And then when you have more entrants, then there's enough retrenchment in reserves at the individual level that there's more stability.
Okay, thank you very much.